10th Biology, Unit 17, Reproduction in Plants and Animals. In this part, we are going to learn about pollination, types of pollination, and agents of pollination. Development of fruit takes place in flowering plants after the completion of two events. The first one is pollination and the second one is fertilization. After the completion of pollination and fertilization, the flower develops into a fruit. In this part, let us learn about pollination. The central part of the flower is female part, that is gynoecium. The top of the gynoecium has stigma. Androecium is the male reproductive part. It is made up of stamens. End of the stamen has anther. This anther produces pollen grains. Pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma. This process is called pollination. What is called as pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. There are two types of pollination. They are self-pollination and cross-pollination. First, let us learn self-pollination. It is called as autogamy. Self-pollination takes place in two ways. Pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of the same flower. Second case, pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Both the flowers arise from the same plant. Now let us see the first type of self-pollination. Pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of the same flower, or pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of another flower of the same plant. Both the types come under self-pollination. Self-pollination is possible in bisexual flowers. This is a bisexual flower because it has female part at the center and stamens form androecium, that is male part. Self-pollination is possible in certain bisexual flowers. This is the first advantage. Flowers do not depend on agents for pollination. Cross-pollination depends on agents like insects, wind, water. Insects carry pollen grains, wind, water carry pollen grains. But here, the pollination does not depend on agents. There is no wastage of pollen grains. The pollen grains are not transferred for long distance. The chance for pollination is high. So there is no wastage of pollen grains. The self-pollination has its own disadvantages. The seeds are less in number. The fruits produce few seeds. The endosperm is minute. In coconut, the edible part is endosperm. Endosperm is a nutritive tissue found inside the seed. The endosperm is used by the newly developing plant from the seed in the beginning stage. This endosperm is minute. New varieties of plants cannot be produced because pollen grains fall on the stigma of the flowers of same plant. So there is no chance for the formation of new characters and new varieties of plants. These are the disadvantages of self-pollination. This is a flower of plant A and this is a flower of plant B. When pollen grains are transferred from plant A to the flower of plant B, that is cross-pollination. Let us see. Here agents are necessary. Wind, water, insects carry pollen grains from one flower to another flower of another plant. Pollen grains are transferred from a flower to stigma of another flower of another plant. This is cross pollination. Transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of another flower of another plant is called as cross pollination. Cross pollination needs agent. Cross pollinations have a number of advantages. The seeds develop and germinate properly, and more good plants are produced. Cross pollination leads to the production of new varieties. The pollen grain of one flower falls on the stigma of flower of another plant, so new varieties are produced. More viable seeds are produced. The viable seeds germinate and produce new plants. In this pollination, more viable seeds are produced. Cross pollination depends on agents. Now let us see the agents of pollination. Animals, insects, wind, water are the agents of pollination. Pollination by wind is called as anemophily. Some flowers produce more number of pollen grains. The pollen grains are carried through wind for around 1000 kilometers. Pollen grains are carried for long distance, so the flowers produce more number of pollen grains. During the time of pollination, the pollen cloud is formed. The pollen grains are produced more in number, they form a cloud. And the pollen grains are smaller, smooth, dry, and light in weight, so that the pollen grains can be easily carried by wind. The stigmas of the flowers are feathery. The feathery stigma comes out of the flower, so the stigma can easily trap or capture the pollen grains float over the wind. It is seen in grasses and some cacti, sugarcane like plants. Pollination by insects is called as entomophily. Study of insects is called as entomology. Pollination by insects is called as entomophily. Flowers pollinated by insects are attractive. They are brightly colored to attract the insects. They produce sweet smell and they produce nectar. Nectar is a food for insects. Nectar is a sugary substance. The brightly colored flowers and the smell and nectar attract the insects for pollination. When the flower is pollinated by insects, the flower produces large size pollen grains, and the outer part of the pollen grains has spines and pits. Pollen grains are larger in size. Exine is pitted and spiny. Exine, what is exine? Outer wall of pollen grain is exine. The exine is pitted and spiny. In the case of entomophilous flowers, what is entomophily? Pollination by insects is called as entomophily. 80% of insect pollination is done by honeybees. Pollination by water is called as hydrophily. Hydrophily is a pollination by water. It is seen in aquatic plants. Here the plants live inside the water. They also produce more number of pollen grains. Pollen grains float on the surface of water. Pollen grains are produced by male flowers. The pollen grains float on the surface of water. The stigma are on the surface. When they reach the stigma of female flowers, pollination takes place. The pollen grains float on the surface of water. While floating on the surface, they reach the stigma. In this way, they pollinate the female flowers. Pollination by animals is called as zoophily. The flowers are attractive colored, larger in size. They produce nectar. The bright color and large size and scent produced by the flowers attract the animals. Animals are attracted by bright color and large size and scent of the flowers. Sunbird pollinates flowers of canna and gladioli. Squirrels pollinate silk cotton. Pollination is the first activity for the fruit formation in sexually reproducing flowering plants. In this part, we learned about what is pollination and types of pollination. We also have learned the agents of pollination. In the next part, we will discuss about fertilization.